Hello everyone, thank you for joining me again and welcome to any new viewers. This is To The Point English with Ben. I'm Ben, and in this video I'm going to teach you some advanced phrasal verbs which you can use in academic writing. Now of course these phrasal verbs can also be used in other situations, you're speaking for example, but the reason I wanted to specifically focus on academic writing today is because it's a question I get very often from my students. It's whether they can use phrasal verbs in their essays or reports or proposals or any of sort of the more formal tasks in their Cambridge English exams. And I think the confusion is that phrasal verbs are often more colloquial. That's true. They're more informal. Often they're quite slang, but not always. They're really like any vocabulary. There is more formal vocabulary, which is more appropriate for academic texts. And more informal vocabulary, which is not appropriate for academic text. So you just need to know what phrasal verbs you can use in your essays, for example. So it can be very confusing, and that's why I think it's a good idea just to learn a few that you know you can use in your essays, so you can feel confident on the day of your exam or whenever you have to write some kind of academic text at work, for example. You can feel confident that you're using appropriate phrasal verbs. Now, I would say that in the exams, you shouldn't overuse phrasal verbs. I mean, the essays and all the tasks really in the Cambridge exams are quite short. So I recommend you use 1 or 2, maybe 3 phrasal verbs if they're appropriate. But overusing them, using too many, is usually not appropriate for more formal tasks. But if you are preparing for either the C1 Advanced or C2 Proficiency Cambridge English exam, and you're feeling a little bit lost, you're not really sure how to organize your preparation, check out my preparation courses in the description to this video. I cover every single part of the exams, looking at my tips on strategy and approach, and also we look at some sample papers, and there are some quizzes in there just to check that you're paying attention to the content. Okay, but let's get straight on with the first phrasal verb for this video, which is to narrow down. Narrow down. And to narrow down means to reduce the number of options or possibilities, usually in a list of some kind. So let's look at an example. There are so many options for further education these days that it's useful to narrow them down to the most realistic. Okay, so there are so many options for further education these days. You know, when you're leaving school nowadays, you have lots of different degrees you can study, lots of different institutions for further education. It can be quite overwhelming, so it's useful to narrow them down. You have all these options, all these possibilities. Let's say you have 10 different options. It's a good idea to narrow them down, reduce them just to 2 or 3 of the most realistic, the most suitable for you. Okay, let's move on to number 2 now, which is to factor in. Factor in. It's quite a specific phrasal verb, and it basically means to take into account, but usually more specifically with calculations. When you're making some kind of calculation, you need to factor in certain elements or variables. So as always, an example will help you understand this one. And in this case, this is a real example I found on the internet. E-scooters are becoming very popular, but we have to factor in the weather. Okay? So e-scooters, these new scooters you see everywhere in big cities now that fly around the streets, they're becoming very popular, so that's a fact. But we also have to factor in the weather. So we have to factor in the weather. So when you're judging how popular these e-scooters are, you need to take into account in your calculations the weather. So the weather is an influence, right, on how, if it's raining, I guess they're suggesting, or very cold, then fewer people are going to use e-scooters. They're more likely to take their car or maybe public transport of some kind. So you need to factor in, when you're calculating the popularity or considering the popularity of these e-scooters, you have to take into account or to factor in the weather. Okay, number 3 now, allude to. Allude to. This is very formal, and some people may say this is not a phrasal verb. It's a bit debatable about whether this is a phrasal verb or not, or whether it's just a verb with a preposition that collocates. But I take this from Cambridge, from the Cambridge dictionary, and it's considered a phrasal verb there and in many other dictionaries, so If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for this video. And to allude to means to indirectly refer to someone or something. So indirectly is a very important word there. You're not explicitly referring to someone, it's indirectly. So let's look at an example. The author of the first text alludes to the issue of education in poor areas. So the author of the first text, here I was thinking about the C2 Proficiency essay task, but it could be any essay task or any formal or academic writing text. But the author alludes to the issue of education in poor areas. So maybe the author didn't explicitly or directly mention education in poor areas, but he or she alluded to this. So there's something in the text that referred to it indirectly. So a very useful phrasal verb, and as I said, quite advanced, so it should get you some more marks if you can use it appropriately and in the correct context. And the next phrasal verb, which is C2 according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is to rule out. Yeah, I was a bit surprised that rule out is considered C2 vocabulary, but it is. So it's a very useful phrasal verb to use. Maybe you know it, maybe you've used it before, but to rule out means to dismiss or exclude from consideration. So it's right to disregard something or eliminate from consideration. The company refused to rule out more redundancies next year. So the company refused to rule out more redundancies, so they're not excluding or dismissing the possibility of more redundancies. So obviously there have been some redundancies, and when questioned or when asked, the company couldn't or refused to rule out the possibility. Another example, because it's very topical at the time of making this video, Boris Johnson hasn't ruled himself out of the leadership election. So at the time of making this video, Liz Truss, the Prime Minister, has just resigned, just stepped down, and there are a lot of rumours of Boris Johnson potentially returning, and he hasn't ruled himself out yet, so we'll see what happens. Probably by the time you watch this video, you'll know. And the next phrasal verb is scale back, to scale back. And this basically just means to reduce in size or amount. It's usually quite systematic. It's not just suddenly, it's a systematic reduction in size or amount. So again, it can be used in formal texts or formal situations in general. To tackle climate change, we need to scale back meat production. So to tackle climate change, we need to scale back meat production. So that's quite a common opinion, that meat production or meat consumption is having a harmful effect on the environment and contributing to climate change. So to systematically reduce the production of meat, so to scale back meat production. The next one is to bring about. To bring about. Yeah, this is a really useful one, I think, because it can be used in many different situations, used for many different topics. And the meaning is basically to make something happen, to cause something to happen or to make something happen. And the example is, to bring about real social change, people need to come together. Okay, so to bring about real social change, so to make social change happen, or to cause it to happen, we need to come together. People need to come together. Okay, so to bring about. And another very useful phrasal verb, advanced phrasal verb for your academic texts, is to stem from. To stem from. Now, you may be familiar with this one. It's perhaps one of the more common phrasal verbs. And it basically means to be caused by. To be caused by. So the example is, most problems at work stem from miscommunication. Most problems at work stem from miscommunication. So most problems are caused by, or the origin of most problems is miscommunication, so a lack of good quality communication. Okay, so those are the really advanced phrasal verbs which you can use in your academic text. I don't want to give you too many because, first of all, you won't remember them all, and second of all, as I said, I don't recommend you fill your essays or reports or proposals with phrasal verbs. Just use one or two or three. But those are really advanced ones. But of course there are more that are less advanced which you can use in academic texts. So I thought I would just give you a few more phrasal verbs which are not necessarily that advanced, that you're probably already familiar with, you should be familiar with actually, but they're very useful for academic texts. So for example, to carry out, to carry out. So this can be used in really formal texts. Carry out basically means to do something or to perform a task. So, for example, to carry out an experiment, to carry out a study. That's the context that you can use carry out. So as I said, you should know that, but it's just knowing that you can use it in academic texts. Similarly, focus on. I'm sure you're familiar with focus on, which means to give attention to one particular thing. But that's fine to use in most academic texts, as well as to point out, which means to bring someone's attention to something in particular, to point out. Again, it's not that advanced, but you can use it in academic texts. And finally, look into, to look into something. Again, you should know this and you should be using it anyway, but it's good to know that you can use it. And to look into, as you know, it means to investigate. So to look into something means to investigate something. Okay, so I recommend you start using those phrasal verbs either in your writings or just thinking of your own examples now. Don't forget about my exam preparation courses if you need some help with your Cambridge exam preparation for the C1 Advanced and C2 Proficiency students. And I look forward to seeing you in another video very soon. Take care.